Hello folks and welcome back to History on the Run, and today we'll be talking about the Union Pacific DDA40X. Now these are diesel locomotives, a little strange here on the channel, we'll get back to that in a minute. But these are diesel locomotives built by EMD between 1969 and 1971. There were a total of 47 produced, each with 6,600 horsepower. That's because these locomotives had twin diesel prime movers. As you can see, they're so long, these locomotives are so long, there's actually a walkway between the two diesel engines so that shop crews can walk between the locomotives without having to walk all the way around these massive locomotives. Because these locomotives were over 82 feet long and just shy of 261 tons. And that makes this locomotive the largest diesel electric locomotive that the Electro Motive Devision ever produced. However, it does have a predecessor, the DD35. But those are two of the largest diesel electric locomotives ever made. Anyway, these locomotives are built by EMD, like I said earlier. Yes, EMD is the Electro Motive Division of General Motors, so these massive trains were actually built by that same company that built your Chevy in your driveway. Interesting how that worked. Now these locomotives are built during the Union Pacific's power-hungry era, as I like to call it. And that basically just means that this was kind of during the era when they were experimenting with the massive turbine locomotives and other massive diesel engines. But anyway, diesel locomotives were also fairly new at the time. They weren't exactly new, but they weren't exactly old, and definitely were being experimented with. So like I said earlier, these locomotives are the predecessor to the DD35, which was a response by the Union Pacific when they were retiring all their gas turbines and various other turbines, such as the coal turbine and everything else that was not working out very well. So they decided to build the DD35s by EMD. Eventually, they decided that the DD35 worked out so well that they should build the DDA40X. X standing for experimental. These locomotives would also get the nickname Centennials, since the first one was delivered in April of 1969, just in time to pull the Gold Spike Limited, which arrived in Salt Lake City in the morning of May 10th to celebrate the driving of the Golden Spike in 1869 for the first transcontinental railroad in Promontory Point, Utah. So, pretty cool, and that's also how these locomotives got their cab number, was to celebrate the year that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Now, like I said earlier, the X in their name stands for experimental, such as the Canadian National inspired comfort cabs, which were also similar to the ones used on the FP45s. This was something fairly new for the Union Pacific, so what better way to experiment with it but put on this locomotive that's basically everything experimental. The locomotive also had Federal Signal Thunderbolt air raid sirens to warn trackside personnel when away from grade crossings and so forth. However, the whole use of that air raid signal did not really catch on, so no results were really collected from it, and therefore it was never really used on any other locomotives. To my knowledge, there might have been a few, but they weren't really used much after that. However, some things that were experimental on these locomotives but became standard on others were things like the modular controls, electronic control systems, which were used in the cabs of these engines and would later on be used on all the EMD-2s, which is pretty neat that at least some things that were used on this engine that were very experimental would later on become standard practice for other locomotives. So kind of neat that some things do carry over, along with some of the stuff with the dynamic braking and all that. So there were some things on this locomotive that did prove to be useful and would carry over to modern locomotives. Now the problem they ended up with was the idea was bigger is better, but as we ended up learning later on, that's not always true. So why isn't the bigger diesel locomotive better? Well, it really comes down to, well, let's just compare it to an AC44. AC44's got 12 wheels, the DD40's got 16. AC44 also weighs a lot less and's got 4,400 horsepower versus 6,600 horsepower. And why is this important? Well, more wheels is more friction on the rails, and more wheels just simply means that by wearing down that rail, you have to pay more money for track maintenance, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to pay more money for track maintenance if these locomotives aren't making that money in pulling tonnage. So maybe those 12-wheel diesel locomotives are better, as we end up finding out later on. The other problem was the horsepower. More horsepower means you need more adhesion, which is part of the reason why these locomotives had 16 wheels. More wheels is more friction, which is adhesion, and means that you can actually put the power down and move it. Now, let's just say you had a car that was basically weightless, and you had all this horsepower. That wouldn't really matter because you wouldn't be able to get moving at any fair rate of speed, because there's no way for it to put traction down and be able to move itself. So the solution to this is to make the locomotives heavier, which again puts more weight on the rails and wears the rails down faster, making more track maintenance. These locomotives are also very heavy. So what we end up finding was the AC-44s were the best of both worlds. They had 4,400 horsepower, which was kind of that sweet spot. Some say it's still too much though. Of not slipping every time they try to put power down and not being able to move because too much horsepower, be it not being so heavy and track maintenance heavy and all those problems, so they were kind of where these locomotives came from. So you can see some of the inspiration for the AC-44s from the DD40. However, the AC-44 is smaller. Like all other good things, the Union Pacific DDA40X would eventually come to an end. The locomotives were becoming increasingly more expensive for the Union Pacific to maintain. However, when running, they were fairly efficient. So the Union Pacific decided to put them into storage for a cold, rainy day when traffic surged. Well, in February of 1984, traffic did surge, and the DD40Xs were brought out of retirement for a little bit to help deal with this extra traffic on the railroad. However, sadly, the traffic on the railroad did eventually slow back down, and the locomotives would be permanently retired in 1985. However, all hope was not lost. 12 of the locomotives survived today, including an additional one that was used as a source for spare parts for 6936, which was kept around by the Union Pacific for excursion services. It ran its last excursion train in 2016. In 2022, the Union Pacific would donate it to the Railroading Heritage of Midwest America Association, and they would return the locomotive to operational condition in 2023. Now you're probably wondering why I said that this is a weird video for the channel. Well, it's because historically on my channel, diesel locomotive history videos don't do very well. But I decided that, you know what, I'm gonna make a video about diesel locomotive anyway, because I bought this locomotive right here. This is an MTH Premier. Actually, I've got a whole video coming out on this here shortly on the channel. And I'm super excited about it. I thought I'd just share it here on YouTube and make a history video while I'm at it. Go keep an eye out for that model train video. It's definitely not going to be very long. I'm not exactly a model train reviewer. I just enjoy model trains. I'm also a railroad fanatic. I know everything about them, so the model trains just seem natural. But yeah, I don't get too terribly deep into all the little details that these locomotives have. But I will say, having an engine like this, I do appreciate the little details. I just simply don't talk about them that much because I just don't really like making videos about model train reviews. I set out originally on this channel to make model train reviews, and I did it a couple times, and I've never done it since because I just don't really like it that much. And I like making the history videos better. I think they're a little easier. Every time I try to plan out a model train review video, it just doesn't work very well for me, and I end up making a history video anyway. So, yeah, I don't know. But anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please like, subscribe, share the video with your friends and family, and as always, folks, see you on the rails.